Firstly, thank you for this eclectic gathering. We have ministers from important countries, our colleague from Ecuador, our colleague from Argentina. We also have provincial education ministers from South Africa. We have people from Turkey. We have people from the civil society sector. And I think, therefore, it's an intelligent gathering to try and wrestle to the ground, A, what we do with SDG 4, but B, what do we do in the current crisis when we've got, 1.2, 1.3 billion kids around the world whose school education is in the process of being torpedoed by COVID-19. Whereas my own kids have left school, one's at university, the youngest guy, and he's completing his course online. I have two little grandkids, one whose kindergarten is disrupted, and so he's missing his best friend, Henry. And that affects his behavior at home, even though he's just gone back to kindy. And my little granddaughter is in the second year of primary school, and she's delighted to go back and see her friends. But I've been here in the Australian COVID lockdown observing their, Vicky, the little girls, who's 7, her education patterns and patterns of learning online during the crisis. And it's caused me to think how children around the world in developed and developing countries have managed this crisis. So thank you for convening. I'm always reluctant to extrapolate from the Australian experience, given how disparate everyone else's national experiences are. I'm acutely conscious that Australia is a developed country. I'm acutely conscious of the fact that by international standards, it's a relatively well-funded education system. And I'm acutely conscious of the fact that preaching from a developed country perspective can often be utterly irrelevant to emerging economy needs and realities. However, in my political career, I've also been responsible for our International Development Assistance Program and the relative prioritization of funding with what was then, I think, one of the top 10 aid budgets in the world. And I do remember the difficulty of getting education and school education support and assistance properly prioritized within our development assistance priorities for around the world. As you know, at the top of the pile will also come various dimensions of emergency disaster relief. Then comes the questions of, let's call it all the arms of public health. And then will come a range of priorities such as sanitation and water and hygiene. I'm the global chair of the Global Partnership on Sanitation and Water for All. So you can refer to me as the Sultan of Sewerage, or as my kids call me, the King of Toilets. And my job is to work with our friends in the World Bank and elsewhere about how do we properly prioritize funding and national budgetary priorities for water and sanitation around our 50 to 60 target countries around the world where we still have major problems. In the absence of facilities, the real problems of open defecation, disease, and the rest. And of course, deal with the operational reality of inadequate toilet and water facilities at schools in various parts of the world, and the particular challenges which girls have, and particularly in areas of menstrual hygiene when they're at school, and it becoming a disincentive for kids, young girls, to attend school. So I am mindful of my own experience as the minister responsible and as the Prime Minister responsible for international development assistance budget, which sought concretely to deal with these problems across the Southwest Pacific and Southeast Asia and our emerging programs in Africa as well. So let me just make 2 or 3 general observations and let's go to a dialogue. It's far better that any observations I make are relevant to the questions you will have in your minds. I think the first is this. For any intelligent national political leader, unless you get your quantitative and qualitative investments in education right, then nothing else ultimately works in your country and your economy. And examining the literature on this, as I did in the period before I became Prime Minister, the earlier the investments, the greater the yield over time. The earlier the investments in early childhood education, the earlier the investments in pre-literacy, pre-numeracy, then literacy and numeracy in the primary school years, and often the earliest years of compulsory elementary school, really shaped a child's pedagogical development by the time they reach secondary school, and certainly determine their futures as far as higher education is concerned. So based on those analyses and a lot of academic research and economic research, quite apart from equity-based research, we then, in our period in office, sought to radically increase national education front-end loaded to the earliest years. We brought in compulsory early childhood education for all 3 and 4-year-olds in the country. That wasn't the case before. We brought in paid parental leave to assist with parents with young families. We also, looking at the state of our elementary schools, realized that they'd been built for a different age. And what we did as part of our response to the global financial crisis and the huge priorities which now occur again in terms of what form of stimulus is most effective, I took a very large proportion of our national stimulus strategy and dedicated to the modernization of our elementary schools. We have about 10,000 schools in Australia, so we invested in building something in the order of about 3,500 state-of-the-art libraries, which were fully wired to the national broadband network, including in the poorest parts of Australia, so that digital education was opened up to kids everywhere. And that I have found in my period since leaving political office is the investment which has been most valued by teachers and parents and kids as I travel around the country. So my overall first point is that from a simple national public policy priority point of view, if political leaders do not understand that education must be their #1 priority, both in terms of social justice, but frankly in terms of national economic development, then their priorities are wrong. And that within that, the priority lies in the maximal investments in the earliest years, because that fundamentally shapes a kid's pedagogical development. The second point I'd make out of 3 points before we go to a conversation is this. I genuinely understand in the current COVID-19 crisis and the collapse of economic activity around the world, and the fact that we now have the single biggest global contraction in growth, at least since the Second World War and arguably since the Great Depression, that the competition for public funding resources within national jurisdictions is huge. I understand that. I've sat around cabinet tables, both at the provincial level in Australia, when I used to be cabinet secretary, where we physically delivered education systems, and at the federal level as a prime minister, where you're responsible for the funding allocations. And in periods of crisis, when public resources are scarce, when the tax base is collapsing, when overall revenues are under stress, I understand the difficulty of the competition for resources. Therefore, the prioritization fight, which ministers must then engage in to maximize their share of those resources for kids in schools, is critical. Of course, unless that is done, and unless we find a way of sustaining education for kids of school age, either online or in new arrangements with physical classrooms, we create a massive and rapidly unfolding set of social and economic problems for our various countries. Countries which in the last 50 years have gone through radical disruptions in education, even if only for a few years, the downstream social and economic consequences and political consequences for those countries are huge and universally negative. I'm a sinologist by training. I specialize in China. Before I went to politics, I was a student of Chinese language. I worked in our embassy in Beijing. I'm a student of Chinese political history, and the downstream consequences of destroyed educational opportunities for the kids of the Cultural Revolution generation was felt for decades and decades afterwards. Now, I hope we're not looking for a COVID-19 disruption of a decade. I hope we're only looking at COVID-19 disruption of a year or two. But in the arguments that you mount with your national jurisdictions, unless this is attended to, it is, together with public health, the absolute twin pillars of sustaining the fabric of our societies and economies going forward. Thirdly, and I'll finish on this, and given our friends from the World Bank are here, International Finance Corporation, the regional development banks, while not at this table, are around, and also philanthropic organizations like OSF and others who do great work in the world. Leveraging alternative sources of finance beyond national budgets and beyond individual parents' ability to pay or to subsidize education programs within their jurisdictions does turn us back to alternative means of raising capital, albeit temporarily, for the duration of this crisis in order to triage our systems. I think, therefore, it'll be important to listen to our friends from the bank as to how this can best be done. What I do know is that globally, the cost of capital at present is relatively cheap. Borrowing costs in most countries, not all, are negligible. And therefore, there is an opportunity for education bonds to be funded one way or another, which underpin the financial needs of national systems whose taxation bases have collapsed altogether. So I'll leave my three sets of comments there, if that's okay, and happily enter into a discussion.
Thanks for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe for more videos from Brookings.